Now, the barking of the dog uh, bothered me a little bit at the end of the story yesterday, so I'm going to kind of recast that a little bit. Um, the kids here in Story, Wyoming, know our dog really well, Casey. Um, and when we're walking or when they're in the area, she's very friendly. She's a half Malinois, half German Shepherd, and they love her and she loves people. But she also thinks whenever anybody's coming close to the house that she needs to defend us. So she starts barking. Anyway, so what I wanted to go back and recast a little bit was when Adzul got to the top of the ridge, he had about 200 yards. The staircase road went down the other side of the ridge, about 200 yards to a another road, to an Incan road, which um, stretched away up a valley, and it went around. The road disappeared around a corner of a hill, about a quarter of a mile from the bottom of the stairs, and it wove through a little valley and then out into a straight stretch um, going north. So when Adzul got to the top of the ridge, he knew that he had to get down fast because the conquistadors could come down faster on their horses in the dirt to the side of the staircase than he could. So he, you know, hair streaming out behind him, flew down the staircase 2, 3 steps at a time with his arms outstretched for balance. And by some miracle, he never fell. Made it to the bottom of the stairs, looked back, and they were just appearing at the top of the ridge. And sure enough, they saw him and started yelling and screaming and took their horses into the dirt on either side of the staircase and came charging down. And he took off at a run, running as fast as he could, and reached the bend around the hill. And he could hear them yelling still faintly behind him, and there was no place to hide. The slopes went up on either side with grass. It was the end of their summer and yellow grass, and no trees, no bushes. I think I mentioned that. No trees, no bushes to hide. And he had no place to go, and so he started taking off his armor shirt because he wasn't going to let them torture him. Um, he knew what they would do. Probably uh, stake him out on the ground when they got him back to the city. Stake him out on the ground and build a fire. At first, skin him alive, and then stake him out on the ground and build a small fire on his stomach and let him die that way. So he was stripping off his, starting as he ran, he was starting to strip off his armor shirt when he saw the rock. Up to the hill to the right, to his right, about 75 yards up, was a flat rock, a long flat rock lying, a boulder lying in the grass. And it was probably, oh, maybe, I don't know what, 18 inches tall and flat, and looked like he could hide behind it. So he bent down and put his ear to the road, and he could hear the hooves pounding through the rock road. He could hear the hooves pounding as the horses reached the bottom and came. And they were about a quarter of a mile behind. He started climbing, and he was climbing like a dog with his hands out front and his feet kicking behind, and he was desperate, and the dirt kept giving way under his hands, but he climbed and climbed, and he heard him getting closer and closer. And just before they appeared on the road below, he threw himself down behind the rock. Sure enough, he didn't look, he just threw himself down behind the rock. Sure enough, the five horses thundered by, um, the guys yelling and screaming, and went around another bend. Now he knew that when they cleared this little bending road in this little valley, that there was a long straightaway. And when they didn't see him, they would be back. And sure enough, in about 8 minutes, he heard the hoofbeats coming back down the road. Now, he had decided he needed to put more distance between himself and them, so he had gotten about 30 yards up the hill when they reappeared, and he flopped down in the grass. Now, the grass was pretty tall. The grass was about as tall as the rock, and it was getting dark. Uh, all this, the battle and the flight and everything, it was late afternoon, coming on evening, and it was getting dark um, faster and faster. And he heard the horse. He didn't look up. He didn't dare look up. And he heard the horses stop below, and they had spotted the rock. And they got off their horses and started talking. And he risked one, as it was getting pretty dark, and he risked one look up over the grass or through the top of the grass, and he saw them pointing up the hill at the rock. And then he saw two men start up, one on one side of the rock and one on the other. So they started climbing, and they were a lot slower climbing than he was. And he knew what they were trying to do was flank him, get on either side of the rock and then close in on him. They didn't know he had gotten a little further up the hill. And he heard them, and their armor, clattered, and they didn't keep quiet. They were talking to each other in Spanish, calling back and forth to each other as they got higher and higher up the hill. And then the clanking got slower as they got closer to the rock. And by now, it was almost full dark. It was so dark you couldn't see hardly anything more than 20 yards in front of you. And he waited. And as they got closer to the rock, they slowed. And they talked to each other. You could hear them talking back and forth, and they were undecided about who was going to go first and how they were going to get him. And he waited until he heard the sounds on the left of the rock, clanking of armor. And then he got to his knees with his loaded sling and started whirling it around his head. And the noise of the whirring was, broke the silence. And he could hear them talking to each other. And when the one on the left spoke, he loosed the rock at the sound. And there was dead silence for a minute. And then there was a scream of pain and a crashing and clattering and screaming as the soldier on the left tumbled down the hill. This is a really steep hill. And what had happened was the rock had hit the soldier in his left shoulder and broken the shoulder blade. And the pain was incredible, and it knocked him down, and then he lost his balance, and gravity took over, and he crashed and rolled all the way down to the bottom of the hill, screaming with every time that shoulder was impacted. Adzul, after he heard the scream, didn't wait. He loaded another rock and sent it in the direction of the right-hand soldier. And that guy was smart because he ducked down and the rock went right over the top of his head. And now it was full dark, he wanted no part of this game in the darkness. And he started sliding down the hill, calling to the men below who were tending to the first soldier. While the guys were climbing, they built a fire down on the road, and they were tending to the first soldier who had landed finally down at the bottom of the hill. So Adzul stood up. they couldn't see him. It was dark now, and he could see him around the fire, and they were talking and everything. He didn't wait. He just took diagonally off across the hill and made his way along the hillside until he was out of sight of the soldiers and the fire. Then he descended down to the road and started running. Now, I'm not talking about a full out run. I'm talking about he started a jog, maybe a little bit faster than a jog, but it didn't stop. It was a pace that could eat up the miles, and the Inca runners could just maintain it for a long, long time. He ran all through the night under a brilliant starlit sky. The temperature dropped well below freezing. All he had was his armor, vest, and his sandals, and that's it. But the running kept him moderately warm, and he ran all night, didn't stop. And as dawn was coming, he was getting, he had been all night incredibly thirsty from the exertion, the stress, everything. And as dawn came, he started to get light enough he could see a stream up ahead and just coming across the road, and he headed for it. As he got closer, he noticed animals lying down along the stream, and he noticed a fire. And he realized the animals were llamas, and he realized this was a trader camp. And he saw two figures by the fire, and so he whistled so that they wouldn't be alarmed and ran into the camp. Well, the first thing he did was he went to the stream and drank and drank and drank, and then went into the camp of these two traders. It was an older man and a younger man, and they were cooking some potatoes. Now, the Inca people, to this day, still eat these small potatoes. That's a basic food subsistence for them. These small potatoes, and they grow them and they can freeze them, and they last a long, long time frozen. So it's a food staple, and it is to this day. So these guys were making some breakfast, and they immediately gave him food, helped him bind up the wound on his leg, which had long since stopped bleeding, but there was blood, all down his leg. He got the blood cleaned up, and gave him something to eat, and he told him what had happened at Petiti. And the older one, and he told him who he was, and the older one said, "I knew your father. I knew Keist. He was a great man, and he kept that city hidden for all these years. And sooner or later, the conquistadors were going to find it. But he protected us all these years, and we've been way, way up north, all summer trading up in the lands way, way to the north, and we're heading back with the goods we traded for to Petiti." And Adzul said, "Well, I don't know what happened with the battle, so you guys better be really, really careful, and you ought to be careful about heading down the road, because these conquistadors are coming after me." And the old trader smiled and he said, "We'll take to the hills." He said, "They're looking for you. They're not looking for llamas." And the younger man said, I'd like to stay and fight them, but I don't think we have enough advantage." And the older man said, "No, we got to keep on our way, protect our goods, and head on down to Petiti." So they rummaged around in their packs, and they got out a Inca hat with ear flaps. It's kind of like it'd be a woven woolen hat made out of alpaca, but a woven woolen hat with ear flaps, kind of like we'd see in the ski slopes today. And they gave him a tunic, a wool tunic, which was sleeveless but went down to just above his knees. And they gave him a woolen cloak. This is winter clothing. They gave him a woolen cloak, which was knee length and wrapped itself around him. And the combination of that clothing, plus on his, on his chest, he had his armor shirt, which was thin, but still gave some warmth. They gave him that stuff. They gave him he took the cloak and made a bundle out of it and put some dried meat and potatoes that they gave him and some cocoa leaves, which is another staple of the Inca people. Put some cocoa leaves in it, and he took off. And he, just jogged away up the road. And the last time he looked around, he could see them way up on the ridgeline, way up on the ridgeline of hills, because there were steep mountains both sides, really high snow-capped mountains on both sides of this valley, and then ridges lower down. And he saw them way high up on a ridgeline with the llamas, and they were, a mile away the last time he saw them, heading toward Patiti. So on he went, and he kept this pace all day, every day. And occasionally he'd come to a little small Inca village along the road, and he would stop and get more potatoes and some dried meat, as much as they could share with him. And then he'd warn them about the conquistadors coming after him, because when he would top a tall hill on the trail and look back 2, 3, 4 miles back, he could see the horses still coming. And he was amazed that they stayed after him. But what he didn't know was that these conquistadors knew that if they did not come back without him, they were dead men. The captain would kill them. So he kept going, and he went for 8 days, and it took a terrific toll. He had to run well into the night. Now, they pushed their horses too hard in the beginning, and finally the horses just couldn't keep running, and they had to slow down. And if he ran into the night, maybe what we would think 9, 10 o'clock, he could maintain a good distance. And then he'd start at daylight. He could maintain a distance, because they tended not to ride into the night. They had to make food for themselves, and they didn't have any food. They hadn't left Patiti with food, so they had to raid villages or do whatever they had to do to get food and grazing for their horses. So by running into the night, he kept a more or less a 2 to 3 mile distance. But the days went by, and he got haggard. His face, big circles under his eyes. He was slender anyway, but he got thinner and thinner, even though he had potatoes and dried meat from the villages. And on the 8th day, he knew he was getting close to the northern end of the frontier. Now, long since the road had disappeared, he was on just a path. And he knew the path, he was getting to the end of the empire. He also knew from discussion with traders through the years that once they got out of the empire, there was about a 50-mile long, pretty level valley with big mountains on either side. And the trail went on up that valley, and he knew he would be too much out in the open, and they'd get him. So he was looking for some way to. He knew the mountains on either side to the east gave way and dropped down into jungle. On the west, they dropped down into lowlands and ocean. but he was more on the eastern side of the mountains than on the western side. And he kept looking for a way to get off the path. And on the 8th day, as he was running along, he saw over a pretty high hill on his right to the east mountains. He realized that the break was a valley running east. And the hill to the side of him was pretty high, and it was really coming on winter now, and the grass was dried, but it was pretty rocky. And so he climbed the hill, always stepping on rocks, always stepping on rocks to leave no trail. And he climbed the hill, went over the top, down the other side, on rocks, and sure enough, there was a valley heading east. And he started up the valley, trying to disguise his tracks as much as he could, but also not spending a whole lot of time. He had to keep moving forward. He was pretty sure that the conquistadors were far enough behind him that they hadn't seen him go over the hill, and that they would think he kept on going, and they'd go past this hill. But he wasn't positive, and he went on day after day. Now he ran out of food, and 2 or 3 days up the valley, he stopped at a stream and was bending down to get a drink, and he had had no food for 36 hours. And as he was raising his head from the stream, he saw movement on rocks off to his left, and he stayed dead still and watched. And a little gray animal came out on the rocks. He recognized it instantly. It was a chinchilla. And it nosed around the rocks, and then disappeared out of sight. And as soon as it disappeared out of sight, he straightened up and moved as close as he dared and hid behind a rock, got his sling out, and waited. And 5 minutes went by, 10 minutes went by, 15, and then the chinchilla appeared and stood up on a rock. And Adzul only had time for about 2 swings of the sling, and he let the rock go. And the chinchilla moved at the sound, but didn't know quite what to do, and then it was too late. The rock hit him, killed him. And now the chinchilla is not a very big animal, but Adzul waited patiently, and over the next 2 hours, he got 8 chinchillas. Made a little fire, cooked them. There was not much meat. He ate everything on those chinchillas except the bones, and then moved on. And it enormously refreshed him for the next day, day and a half. And he found another colony of chinchillas about a day and a half later, got a few, and kept going. At the end of the 5th day, he came to a rushing mountain stream. It wasn't a river, but it was really rushing across the valley from left to right. And it was too swift and deep. It wasn't a river, but it was too swift and deep to cross. And it came out of glaciers way high up on the left side of the valley. And he got a drink and everything, and then he thought he went downstream to the right, and he came to a place not far away where the water fell 120 feet down in a waterfall to a huge pool of water down below. And he could look into the distance There were no mountains blocking his view. And he looked, and miles away on the horizon was a carpet of green. And he knew he'd come to the eastern side of the mountains. And below him, miles down the mountains, was a jungle. And what we know today, it's what we call the Amazon basin. His dad had told him about the jungle on the eastern side of the mountains, but he'd never seen it or anything. Um, and he was looking down miles and miles down to what we now know as the Amazon basin. But the cliffs on either side of this waterfall were sheer black rock cliffs. There wasn't a handhold, there wasn't anything. There was no way to get down these cliffs. So he decided he'd go back, and it was dark, getting dark, and he'd spend the night by the river, and then he'd climb up the hill to the left, to the west side, and cross where the stream was much, where it was crossable, and go on up the valley until he found another way off the mountains. No food that night. And he wrapped himself in his cloak, his tunic, pulled his hat and earmuffs. I mean, it was getting well below freezing every night. But with this gear, that's how the Inca people dealt with winter. He was perfectly warm, perfectly comfortable. He wasn't warm, but he was comfortable enough every night with these garments. And he lay down at the base of a big gray rock close to the edge of the river. And his cloak was grayish brown. It blended perfectly with the rock. And he went to sleep. He woke up in the pre-dawn. The light was just a little bit grayer than black. And the medallion was hot on his chest. When the conquistadors had been chasing him, the medallion was hot, but as soon as he left them behind, it grew cooler and cooler. Hadn't been hot ever since. The medallion was hot on his chest. And that's where we're going to end episode 2. Now, those of you who know the heirs of the medallion know the story, but those of you who don't, why don't you have a try at describing what you think is going to happen next? And when we get to episode 3, you'll find out what my imagination dealt with in the next minutes and hours.